Hello, this is another short video on the Bible as literature, this time focusing on the Gospels. And the Gospels are a particular part of literature. Let me share my screen for you. Okay. Now, to discuss the Gospels as a particular type of literature is really a broad topic, which would take a lot of time to adequately cover. And I can't really do it in this short video, but I'm going to hit what I think are a few high points that we can talk about as the Gospels as literature. So, first of all, the Gospels are a unique type of literature. If you were to say what kind of literature is it, you'd maybe say it's closer to a biography of Jesus than anything else, but that really isn't quite it. There are several things in the Gospels which are quite different from other biographies. Just to name a few, one is that the time element is unusual. Rather smoothly covering the entire life of a person, the focus in the Gospels is almost entirely on the last 3 years of Jesus's life. And even within that, a large part of the focus is on the last 2 weeks of Jesus's life. So the time element is quite different from other biographies. Also, consider this. Uh, in Acts, Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, says, "In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach." So do and teach. The Gospels talk about what Jesus did and what he taught. In Matthew and John, there's more teaching almost than doing. And in Mark, there's a bit more doing. But that's different from most biographies because most biographies wouldn't contain quite so much about what an individual taught. In addition, in the case of Jesus, a great deal of the teaching was about himself, which is even more unusual. So the Gospels are a kind of literature that's sort of all in a category by itself. If I had to give one line to describe each of the four Gospels as far as what kind of literature they are, Luke would be the closest one to a biography, the way we understand it. John is an evangelical treatise. He says so. Matthew is mostly a teaching document targeted toward Jewish Christians. And Mark is a message to the persecuted church in Rome. And I'll try to describe why I say that about each of the four. All four Gospels are either eyewitness accounts, like Matthew and John were disciples, and Mark may have been there for just a little bit of the final week of Jesus's life, or they're one person removed from eyewitnesses. So Mark may have gotten a good deal of his information from some of the other disciples, mostly Peter, people have reasoned. Luke was not an eyewitness, but he talked to people there who were. The Gospels also contain parables, and I already did a video on parables. That's a unique literary type that's within the Gospels. So John, I said John was an evangelical treatise, and that is clear because John says that's what it is. In John 20, verse 30 and 31, he summarizes his gospel by saying, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So this is a gospel which was written so that people would come to faith in Christ. That was the single focus of the gospel. John was an eyewitness. I want to say some about the eyewitnesses because there are critics today who would allege that the Gospels were written quite a bit later by people who were not eyewitnesses. But the evidence just doesn't actually bear that out. John was an eyewitness. When he's writing, he writes in sort of a pseudo first person. He doesn't say I and me, but when you normally say I and me, he says the other disciple or the disciple that Jesus loved. And finally, he concludes by saying, this is one of those other disciple places. He says, this is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things. So he says he was an eyewitness. And also he knows things like that people wouldn't have known unless they were pretty close. Like he knows that if you go from Cana to Capernaum, you're going downhill. Now, that's not the kind of fact that would be known just to anybody in the ancient Near East, since those are not major cities or anything, but that is the truth. It is downhill from Cana to Capernaum. Also, he knows that there's at the pool of Bethesda, there's a pool there with 5 roofed colonnades. And a lot of people in the past, some critics thought this story was really just made up about the healing at the pool of Bethesda. But archaeologists have discovered the remains of the pool with 5 roofed colonnades. So that really was true. John was there, he knew it. If the gospel had been written after the destruction of Jerusalem, you wouldn't have been able to see that pool. That was in 70 AD. So the gospel was written by somebody who was there before. John's eyewitness account. You can also tell a little bit by the way he writes things, like just to use an example of the resurrection account. When they hear that the tomb is empty, John and Peter run to the tomb. And you can say, John says, he makes the point that he ran faster than Peter and got to the tomb first. And he looked in, but John is not the most bold. Peter's a much more bold. So when Peter gets there, Peter does go in, and then John follows Peter in, and he has the detail that he saw the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, folded up in a place by itself. The sort of detail that an eyewitness would include. Or perhaps at the final fishing episode, well, there it says he believed too. So he's saying what he thought and felt when he saw this. And then in the final fishing episode, he has the outrageous detail that there were 153 fish pulled out of the net. So somebody actually counted the number of fish and came out with that oddball number. Although John was an eyewitness, I do believe it's safe to say that John was written last, I think. He knew the other gospels, but he didn't quote from them. But sometimes it's apparent that he didn't know what was in them. For example, the other gospels describe that somebody cut off the ear of the high priest in the Garden of Gethsemane, but they don't say who did it. John says who did it. It was Peter. Why did the other gospels not include that it was Peter? Well, actually, Peter was still living there in Jerusalem, and the cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant is a felony. So, since Peter was still living there, they didn't put Peter's name in. But by the time John is written, Peter is up and gone, and so that's not really an issue anymore. Or the same thing with Lazarus. There was a plot to kill Lazarus mentioned in the Gospel of John. And so only John includes the story of Lazarus because you probably don't want to get Lazarus killed. The other Gospels were written earlier. And then there are things that come up in the other Gospels that make you wonder, like in Jesus's trial in the book of Mark, there are false witnesses that say, this man said he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. So, but Mark doesn't say that Jesus ever said that. So the question says, is that something Jesus really said? Well, in the book of John, in John 2:19, Jesus does say something kind of like that. And so there was some basis of truth on that charge that came up at Jesus's trial in Mark. And John's readers already knew some of the story. Like he says in John 3:24, this was before John the Baptist was imprisoned. In other words, the readers already knew about John the Baptist and that he was in prison. John doesn't say that. John, the author, doesn't say that. He just assumes the readers already know. Or the charge is laid in John 7, which was a serious charge that said Jesus couldn't be the Messiah because the Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem. Now, John never explained that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but that's in the other Gospels. So he's just assuming that his readers already know that. Unique features in John, he talks about signs. The miracles that Jesus did are called signs in John, pointing to who Jesus is. The other Gospels use a different word, acts of power. John focuses really not just in the Gospel of John, but in the other letters of John too, on Jesus as being the Lamb of God, the Passover Lamb. John likes to also talk about Jesus being the light. In the book of John, Jesus makes a number of I am statements with that sort of takes upon himself the I am that the Lord used back at the burning bush with Moses in Exodus 3. And in John, the focus is on Jesus himself to the exclusion of almost everything else. In other words, there's not a lot of like teaching about how to live the Christian life or that sort of thing. The focus is on the teaching about Jesus himself. Also, in the book of John, there are some features that raise questions that I don't think we can fully answer today. Maybe back at the time it was written, if we had lived then, we would know better, but they're just kind of interesting, and I don't think we can fully explain it today. Like, for example, every time John the Baptist comes into the story, there's really an emphasis that John the Baptist is not the Christ. And that comes up several times. And so you have to wonder when John was writing this, maybe there was a little bit of some sort of a sect or cult that was beginning to exalt John the Baptist too much. Also, John, the author here, has connections with the high priest. That apparently comes up in the trial of Jesus. John, really, the fisherman, he had a connection with the high priest? I'd be curious to know how that came about. Such things can obviously happen, but that's kind of interesting. He doesn't explain how that is. Also, John seems to be using a different chronology than the other Gospels. He may have been going by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and even some of the other Jewish groups had kind of different calendars they used, and John may have been on a slightly different calendar than the other Gospels. Okay, Luke. Now, Luke, he said he was going to write an orderly account. He says that at the beginning, and Luke starts with the story of Jesus's birth, really before Jesus's birth, and ends with the ascension. So Luke can truly be said to have started from the very beginning and gone to the very end. And Luke uses chronological notes. His beginning of his book says here in verse 3, it says, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." So Luke seems to have made a real effort to put things in chronological order. Let's look at some of the chronological notes. We sort of take it for granted because we know all these things, but really the other Gospels don't tell us much about the chronology. It tells us when Jesus was born that Caesar Augustus was the Caesar, and this was when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, the first registration. So it's giving you something to date the census when Jesus was born. And then when Jesus begins his ministry, there's lots of information. He says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So we can put, that at like AD 29 or 30 AD. We can be pretty close, very close on that. It mentions that Pontius Pilate was the governor, Herod was the tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene, and Annas and Caiaphas are the high priests. So he puts all those leaders that would be well known, and are actually, some of them appear in literature outside the Bible, and it allows us to put a very precise date on the beginning of Jesus's ministry. And it also says Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age. If we only had the other Gospels' chronological notes, it would be hard to get to all that now because they just don't give too much of a chronological background. In Matthew, it tells us that Herod the Great was king when Jesus was born. And because Pontius Pilate comes into the story at Jesus's trial, you knew that he was obviously the governor. But the other gospels make no effort to put dates on things. Those people just come into the story. Now, in Luke, it's peculiar that Luke is a Gentile and he uses a large Greek vocabulary, but a lot of the grammar in Luke is Semitic. It reads sort of like it was Hebrew, but it's Greek. And I think this is because Luke was not an eyewitness, but I believe that he got this because he had 2 years of time to do things while Paul was just a prisoner in Caesarea. Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, but Paul gets thrown in prison and he has to stay there in Caesarea, which is the headquarters of the Roman province of Judah. And he has to stay there for 2 years. So Luke had some time, and I think he probably used that time to interview others who knew Jesus personally. And those people were all Jewish, and so that's why his account reads a little bit like it was written by Jewish people, and sometimes. Some of the people that he talked to, maybe Mark, maybe Matthew, and maybe Mary, and perhaps some others. And when I say Mary, I'm talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Consider this as an example of Luke using eyewitnesses. Luke 1 and 2 is absolutely Mary's account. Mary, not Joseph, not anybody else. The angel appears to Mary. Now, an angel appears to Joseph too in Matthew, but Luke doesn't mention that. Simeon talks to Mary at the temple after Jesus' birth. The Gospels describe what Mary said multiple times. It tells you 3 different times what Mary was thinking. Other women come into the story, like Elizabeth and Anna. I mean, this is the most female 2 passages you'll get in the Bible, including the extravagantly girly topic about the baby leaping in the womb. That is not the sort of thing that most men write about, but it's the sort of thing that women do talk about. So I think that when Luke wrote chapters 1 and 2, he was really recording what originally came from Mary. Luke was also a doctor by profession, and there are a few passages in the Gospels which seem to show that they came from a doctor. Jesus had healed this woman with a discharge of blood, but Luke has a little bit more information. He says discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she'd spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. So that would be something a doctor would take note of. And then Luke is the only one who includes this odd medical condition that shows up in the Garden of Gethsemane. It says, being in agony, Jesus prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Time of writing. Well, if Luke had done this interviewing while Paul was a prisoner, then Paul is on trial before a Roman governor. So in Luke's gospel, there's an awful lot of emphasis on the fact that Jesus is innocent. Pilate proclaims him innocent multiple times. So does Herod. And then finally, the soldier at the cross says, surely this man was innocent. The disciples are innocent also in the book of Acts that follows on the book of Luke. And the Romans come out as pretty good people. You know, Paul's on trial before a Roman governor, and then maybe the book is finished perhaps when, at least the book of Acts is finished, when Paul is on trial, waiting for trial before Caesar. So the Romans come across pretty well. There's soldiers, Roman soldiers who visit John the Baptist. There's a good centurion in Capernaum. Pontius Pilate really wants to let Jesus go. And there are other good Romans who continue in the book of Acts. So the conclusion on Luke is this is really like a chronological biography based on information from eyewitnesses. Mark I believe, was written for Italians, or maybe more precisely for Romans. That is what the early Christian church fathers, Papias and Irenaeus, both say about the book of Mark, and there's good internal evidence to support that idea. There are Aramaisms in Mark. There's about 7 of them. I put just 2 of them, like Boanerges is Aramaic, and it means sons of thunder. Jesus says to the little girl, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, arise. But in Mark, you see the Aramaic word Boanerges, and then it says, which is translated sons of thunder. And so always when you use an Aramaic word, Mark translates it. There are others, like on the cross, Jesus says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? On the other hand, he puts a few Latin words in there, and the Latin words are not translated. They just stay in there. And the reason is because his audience would be, they would know Latin. Mark also has this comment here to consider. Look at Mark 7, 3 and 4. He says, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. In other words, Mark's audience are not Jews, and they're not familiar with Pharisees. So Mark has to explain to his audience some of the customs of the Jews, because he's not writing to Jews or people who even knew Jews very well. Mark is action-oriented. There's quite a bit less talking from Jesus in Mark than in any of the other disciples. And even though Mark is the shortest gospel, when it does have a story in Mark, that story usually has more detail than the other gospels. Mark's favorite word seems to be immediately. And I just listed there, just in chapter 1, all the many times the word immediately shows up. And finally, while I said Mark is writing to probably Roman Christians, the ones he's writing to are, I believe, undergoing persecution. There's more on persecution and suffering in Mark than in the other disciples, and also on the disciples and whether they can deal with it. Jesus foretells his death 3 times in Mark. The arrest and trial and crucifixion account in Mark is more graphic than the others. So Jesus' suffering is emphasized. The disciples seem to come across in Mark as more clueless. Now, this is done to make you feel like when you're reading it, oh, we ought to do better than that. And that's the kind of way he's motivating his readers, I think, by pointing out that the earlier disciples, the apostles, initially didn't really get it. There are direct warnings about persecution in Mark, like in 13:11, the parable of the tenants, where the servants of God undergo suffering. You have the rich young ruler who couldn't do it. He wasn't willing to make the commitment that was needed. And Jesus tells his disciples that they have to take up his cross. A disciple has to take up his cross. That's not Jesus's cross. Each disciple has to take up his own cross. And the cross is the instrument of death. It's not like we understand the cross as something we hang around our neck as a symbol. When they heard take up your cross, that would mean you have to be prepared to die. Or consider the ending of Mark. There's quite a bit of discussion about the ending of Mark, why it's short. And verses 9 through 20 on the last chapter are probably not in the original. So people have wondered did we lose the rest of it? And, we might have, I can't say definitively, but consider this. Consider that maybe it really was intended to end just in Mark 16, verse 8. And consider that this is written to a persecuted church. And how should the church respond? So, given that possible audience, consider these verses. The angel says to the ladies, go Tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So the charge to the Christian church in Rome is go and tell. And the comparison is there to earlier people who said they didn't do it, they were afraid. So are you going to go and tell, or are you going to be afraid? That's kind of the way the book of Mark ends. Mark and stories. In the Gospel of Mark, the stories themselves are sequenced to teach lessons. I mean, each story has a lesson in itself, quite a few lessons probably, but also they're put together in a way to teach lessons. For example, in Mark 4 and 5, there's a series of miracles that are performed, and Jesus in the miracles demonstrates, first of all, that he's Lord over nature by calming the storm. He's Lord over the supernatural by casting the demons out in Mark 5. Then he's Lord over sickness of the woman with an issue of blood. And finally, he's Lord over death itself by raising Jairus' daughter. Or you can look at this kind of structuring. Jesus heals Gentiles at Gennesaret, and then he has oppositions from Jewish leaders. And then he heals a Gentile woman. So it's sort of a sandwich there. And then you have structures like this. When the Pharisees can't see, Jesus, says that they can't see in Mark 7. And then a blind man sees, the very next passage. So when you study the Gospel of Mark, don't just look at the individual stories for the lessons they teach, but look at how they're strung together. Mark is teaching a lesson by doing that too. So finally, Matthew. Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels, and therefore it's probably appropriate that it sits there at the beginning of the New Testament, maybe being the best connection of the New Testament to the Old Testament. The emphasis in Matthew is that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Jesus is the Christ. Matthew, alone of the four Gospels, uses long quotes from the Old Testament. Now, all the Gospels use plenty of Old Testament quotes and allusions, but Matthew sets rather long quotes out. And it's similar to what the disciples did to Jewish congregations in the early sermons in the book of Acts. In the same way, Matthew is addressed to Jewish believers and maybe Jewish potential believers too. Matthew uses the words kingdom of heaven a lot in places where the other gospels sometimes say something different, like kingdom of God. And this may reflect the Jewish reluctance to use the name of God very much. Matthew seems to have some behind the scenes details, which are very interesting surrounding Jesus' crucifixion. The behind the scenes things include things like the letter from Pilate's wife to Pilate telling him, please don't have anything to do with this righteous man because I had a bad dream about him. Matthew records that the veil of the temple was torn in two when Jesus was crucified, and the tombs opened and bodies of saints were raised. Matthew is the only gospel that talks about the arrangement for the tomb to be guarded. The chief priest wanted guards to be set at the tomb so that the body wouldn't be stolen. And then after Jesus' resurrection, the guards are bought off. Finally, Matthew is organized for teaching, maybe even for memorization. Things are grouped together in Matthew, like pretty much the full description of what Matthew has to say about how to live the Christian life is in chapters 5 through 7, the famous Sermon on the Mount. All 7 parables about the kingdom of heaven appear in Matthew 13. All 7 woes to the Pharisees show up in Matthew 23. And then all Jesus' teaching about last times or eschatology is in Matthew 24 and 25. And Matthew may even be giving memory aids. Now, there have been a lot of people who have talked about why this verse was in there. This is after the genealogy of Jesus that shows up in Matthew. He says, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. So 14, 14, 14. He divided up into 3 14s. Did Matthew really want you to memorize the genealogy? Maybe so. Matthew is good for topical teaching and study if you want to teach about a topic, largely because it's already kind of structured in that way anyway. It's structured by topic. It's good for memorization, like all the Beatitudes are put together in Matthew 5. And then the similitudes, that's like you are like salt and you're like light, follow together. And then you have all of Jesus' sayings that begin with, you have heard that it was said, together going on in Matthew 5, and so on and so on. Matthew's organized that way. So it's good to memorize, and it's good for topical teaching and study. And that's what I have to say about the Gospels as literature. I hope you enjoy the video, and I'll be back.